Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm thrilled to have you here today. If you're ready to take your English listening and speaking skills to the next level, you've come to the right place. Today we'll dive into something exciting, exploring a gripping story from our latest adventure. We'll unravel the mystery of the Red-Faced Guild, a thrilling tale of a secret operation, a hidden mastermind, and a heist that could change everything. Along the way, we'll practice listening, speaking, and even picking up some useful phrases to boost your fluency. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Visitor. It was a chilly Sunday morning when I decided to visit my old friend, Detective Elias Grayson. I hadn't seen him in a while, and his reputation as one of the sharpest minds in detective work had always fascinated me. He lived in a modest but well-kept townhouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where many of his clients sought his expertise on the most puzzling of cases. As I walked towards his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual might be afoot. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had no real reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't help but feel that my visit would not be as ordinary as I had first expected. I arrived at Grayson's doorstep and raised my hand to knock. But before my knuckles made contact with the wood, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. This wasn't typical for Grayson. He was a man who valued privacy and order above all else. Curiosity piqued. I gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. As soon as I entered, I was greeted by the sound of voices coming from the parlor. One voice was unmistakably Grayson's, deep and calm as always. The other belonged to a man whose tone was much louder and carried a sense of urgency. I could hear snippets of their conversation as I quietly crept closer, not wanting to interrupt. "I'm telling you, this is serious, Grayson. If we don't do something, it's all over," the second voice said, the words thick with anxiety. I pushed the door to the parlor open just a crack, trying to see what was going on. There, seated across from Grayson, was a large man. He had a broad, imposing figure, with a round face that was flushed as if he had been out in the sun for too long. His eyes were small but sharp, and his hair was a deep, bright red. It seemed almost unnatural, like fire itself had taken root on his head. Grayson looked up as soon as he noticed me standing in the doorway. "Ah, Nathaniel, just the man I was hoping to see," he said, his face breaking into a small but knowing smile. He waved me in, clearly unfazed by my sudden arrival. I stepped into the room, still not entirely sure what was going on. It looks like I'm interrupting, I said, glancing between Grayson and the man. I can come back later if you're busy. Nonsense, Grayson said, his voice filled with warmth. You came at the perfect time. Mr. Clayton, allow me to introduce you to my good friend Nathaniel, a man whose wit and skill are nearly as sharp as my own. Nathaniel, meet Mr. Clayton. The large man, Mr. Clayton, stood up from his seat. With a heavy grunt, he extended a hand towards me, his grip firm and confident. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Nathaniel. I'm in need of some advice, and Grayson tells me you might be the one to offer it. I shook his hand, noting the intensity in his eyes. He didn't seem like the kind of man to ask for help lightly, and yet here he was. Something about the whole situation felt out of place, as if I had stumbled into a story that was still unfolding. I'm sure Elias has been a good source of advice, I said, still trying to piece together what was happening. But it seems like this must be quite the dilemma for you to seek us both out. Indeed, Mr. Clayton said, sinking back into his chair with a heavy sigh. I found myself involved in something strange, something that I don't quite understand. Grayson nodded, leaning back in his own chair. Tell Nathaniel everything, Clayton. He's sharp, and his insight might be just what we need. With a deep breath, Mr. Clayton began. It all started a few weeks ago. I received an offer that seemed too good to be true, a job that promised me good money, and all I had to do was, well, it was simple work. But the more I got involved, the stranger things became. As Clayton continued his tale, I listened carefully, trying to make sense of it all. He spoke about a mysterious organization called the Red-Faced Guild, which, according to his story, hired men with red hair for a very specific job. The work itself was mind-numbing, copying the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, but it paid well, £4 a week, which was more than enough to sustain him. But as he spoke, I could tell that something didn't sit right with him. There was an unease in his voice that suggested there was more to this job than just copying books. I exchanged a quick glance with Grayson, who appeared deeply interested in the story. He didn't interrupt, but I could tell he was already formulating his own theories. And what exactly is it that troubles you about this offer, Mr. Clayton? I asked, leaning forward slightly. You're being paid well for something simple. What could possibly be wrong with that? Mr. Clayton paused, his face growing more serious. It's not the work itself. It's the guild. The whole thing is too secretive. I don't know what the end goal is, but I've been asked to do things that don't add up. And now, the guild seems to have disappeared overnight. No one can tell me where they've gone or why they suddenly stopped paying me. I need to know what's going on, Grayson. Grayson's eyes narrowed, and I could see that the case was starting to pique his interest. This is quite the mystery, isn't it, Nathaniel? I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Clayton's words. The red-faced guild, the strange job, and the sudden disappearance. It was all too peculiar to ignore. This is a curious situation indeed, I said, turning my attention back to Mr. Clayton. And it's not every day that one stumbles upon such a case. I'm sure Grayson will figure this out, though. He always does. Grayson simply smiled, but his mind was clearly working at full speed. We'll get to the bottom of this, Clayton. You're in good hands. As we sat there, the mystery beginning to unfold before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would turn out to be one of the strangest cases we had ever encountered. Little did I know, we were about to dive into a tangled web of deception, and the solution would require all of Grayson's legendary skills. And so it began. A simple visit to an old friend, and now we were on the cusp of an adventure that would test both our wits and our courage. Chapter 2. Mr. Clayton's Tale. Mr. Clayton settled deeper into his chair, his large frame seeming to swallow up the furniture as he let out another heavy sigh. The weight of his thoughts seemed to press down on him, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of the chair. I could see that he was nervous, and the story he was about to tell was not one that he had shared lightly. "Where do I begin?" he muttered, looking down at his hands. It all started a few weeks ago when I received an unusual letter, one that I almost tossed out without a second thought. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. Grayson, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly, his steely gaze fixed on Mr. Clayton. "What did the letter say, Mr. Clayton?" The large man took a deep breath and cleared his throat. It was an offer of employment, but not just any job. It was an advertisement for something called the Red-Faced Guild. The letter had an air of secrecy about it, but the pay was more than I could ignore. £4 a week just for copying books. Simple work, really. The ad specified that it was for men with red hair, which, of course, caught my attention. I couldn't help but glance at Grayson. The mention of a strange job involving copying books, combined with the odd requirement of red hair, certainly sounded suspicious. Grayson nodded, encouraging Mr. Clayton to continue. At first I thought it was some kind of prank, Mr. Clayton continued, his voice filled with skepticism. But the letter had a certain air of authority to it, and there was something about the tone that made me feel it wasn't something I should dismiss lightly. The offer was too good to ignore, so I decided to follow up. He paused again, seemingly lost in the memory. I took the address given in the letter and went to the red-faced guild office, which was located in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't a grand building, nothing like you'd expect from a large, established organization. Just a small office on the second floor of a run-down building, tucked away on Fleet Street. Grayson's eyes flickered with interest. Fleet Street, you say? And did you go to the office? Yes, I did. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I figured I had nothing to lose. Clayton continued. When I arrived, I was greeted by a man with bright red hair, just like the advertisement had described. He introduced himself as Duncan Ross, the secretary of the Red-Faced Guild. He was a peculiar man, very friendly, but also very formal. Almost too formal for a simple office. It made me feel as though I was being watched at every turn. I leaned forward, intrigued by the growing mystery. What happened next? Ross led me into a small, dimly lit office. The furnishings were sparse, just a few old chairs, a small desk, and a large bookcase filled with volumes of what looked like encyclopedias. There was a distinct smell of dust in the air, and the whole place felt strangely cold. He explained the job to me. All I had to do was copy the Encyclopedia Britannica, starting with the letter A, and I was to bring my own ink and paper. Simple, right? Mr. Clayton's voice was filled with disbelief as he continued. But here's the catch. The Red-Faced Guild didn't hire just anyone. You had to have bright red hair to be considered. And apparently that was a requirement I met. So, without much hesitation, I agreed to the terms. The pay was £4 a week, which, for a man like me, was a fortune. He shook his head, as though he couldn't quite believe the events that followed. The next morning, I returned to the office. Ross welcomed me again, took a look at my hair, and seemed satisfied. He even pulled my hair to check if it was real, which, to be honest, was a bit unsettling. After that, I was shown to a small desk in the corner, and my work began. I spent hours each day copying articles, my mind drifting as the weeks passed. The work was mind-numbing, but it paid well. I exchanged a glance with Grayson, who was listening intently, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair in thought. So, you were working for this guild for some time? Yes, about 8 weeks, Mr. Clayton answered, his expression growing darker. But as time passed, I began to notice strange things. For one, I was always alone in the office. No one ever came in or out except for Duncan Ross. and he was always in a rush, as if he had somewhere else to be. At first, I thought nothing of it. But then, one day, I began to feel like I was being watched. The office had this eerie silence, and Ross would often leave me there for hours without explanation. Grayson leaned forward, his voice steady. "And you never questioned Ross about this? Never wondered why they would need someone to copy books under such strange conditions?" Mr. Clayton shook his head, his face filled with frustration. "I tried not to think about it too much. The money was good, and I figured I was just doing a simple job. But then, a week ago, something happened that made me question everything." He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze shifting nervously from Grayson to me. "I arrived at the office one morning ready to work when I found the door locked. I knocked, but no one answered. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, a note appeared on the door. It simply read, "The red-faced guild is no longer in operation. Please do not attempt to contact us. We have disbanded as of October 9th, 1890. The air in the room grew tense as Mr. Clayton's words sank in. I could see the bewilderment and frustration in his eyes as he recalled that moment. "Did you try to contact them?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "I did," Mr. Clayton responded, his voice rising with anxiety. "I went to the address listed, but the office was completely abandoned. There was no sign of Ross, no explanation, nothing. It was as if the guild had never existed. The worst part was that I was left without the £4 a week they promised me. I have no idea what happened, but it's been tearing at me ever since." Grayson sat back, his mind clearly turning over the details of Clayton's story. "This is highly irregular," he said softly, almost to himself. "A sudden disappearance of a well-funded organization, a mysterious job for men with red hair, and the odd behavior of Duncan Ross. I see why you've come to me, Clayton. There's something more to this than meets the eye." Mr. Clayton nodded eagerly. "I don't know what it all means, but I want to know the truth. I've been a simple man all my life, and this whole affair has been nothing but trouble. I just want answers." Grayson's gaze shifted to me, his expression unreadable. "Nathaniel, what do you make of this?" I leaned back in my chair, taking in everything I had just heard. There's definitely more to this than a simple job. The red-faced guild, the secretive nature, the sudden disappearance. It's all very strange. But I think Grayson will figure it out. He always does." Grayson smiled knowingly, but his eyes were already glinting with determination. "Don't worry, Clayton. We'll get to the bottom of this. You're in good hands." As Clayton's story came to a close, The room felt charged with anticipation. Grayson's mind was already racing, and I knew that this case would be unlike any we had encountered before. Chapter 3. Unraveling the Clues. As Mr. Clayton finished recounting his tale, I could sense the tension in the room. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath us. Grayson, ever the stoic figure, didn't immediately respond. He sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers together, his sharp eyes glimmering with thought. I could tell that Grayson was already deep into the case, piecing together the clues in his mind. I, on the other hand, was still grappling with the sheer strangeness of Mr. Clayton's situation. A guild that hires only men with red hair? A job that pays more than it should for copying books? And then the sudden disappearance of the organization? There was more going on here than met the eye. Grayson broke the silence first, his voice low and steady. Nathaniel, let's begin by examining the facts. We have a man who was hired under bizarre circumstances by a mysterious group, only to be left with nothing but questions after the group vanishes. What does this tell us? I thought for a moment, my mind trying to catch up with Grayson's rapid deductions. It tells us that this isn't just a job gone wrong. Something deeper is at play. Maybe the guild itself was a cover for something else. Something illegal or dangerous? Exactly, Grayson replied, his eyes narrowing. The job was too simple. A man with red hair copying a book. That alone raises suspicions. But I think there's more to this story, Nathaniel. Something hidden beneath the surface. I glanced at Mr. Clayton, who had been sitting quietly since the beginning of the discussion. He looked nervous, but he seemed to trust Grayson completely, as if he knew that the detective was the only one who could get to the truth. Let's focus on the most obvious clues first, Grayson said, turning to Mr. Clayton. You mentioned that the guild hired only men with bright red hair. Why was that specific condition in place? Mr. Clayton shifted uneasily in his seat. Well, that's what I didn't understand either. I mean, I've got red hair, sure, but it seemed odd that they would limit the job to just those of us who were different. It made me wonder if there was something more to it. But at the time, I didn't think too much of it. Grayson's gaze hardened as he processed Mr. Clayton's words. No, Mr. Clayton, you were right to wonder. The red hair is a key detail, but I don't think it's just about appearance. It's about distinguishing people, setting them apart from the general population. I felt a shiver of realization run through me. You mean it wasn't about the work at all? The guild wasn't interested in the work. They were using the red-haired men for something else? Grayson nodded slowly. Precisely. The red-haired men were being used as pawns in a larger scheme. But what that scheme is, we still need to uncover. I leaned forward, eager to understand more. But why would anyone go through the trouble of creating such a bizarre organization just to hire a few men to copy books? There's got to be something more. Grayson smiled, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. That's the next part of the puzzle. We need to look at the people behind this. Who were these individuals who created the Red-Faced Guild? What was their ultimate goal? I turned to Mr. Clayton. Did you ever meet anyone else besides Duncan Ross? Any other members of the guild? Mr. Clayton shook his head. No, Ross was the only person I ever interacted with. He was always so secretive. Every time I tried to ask about the guild or its purpose, he would change the subject or hurry me along. It was like he didn't want anyone asking too many questions. Grayson was clearly thinking hard. It's clear that Ross wasn't acting alone. There must have been others involved, likely in positions of authority within the guild. But for now, we can't ignore the fact that the guild seems to have vanished overnight, leaving nothing but confusion in its wake. I felt a surge of frustration. And Mr. Clayton, you said you went back to the office after the guild disappeared, only to find it abandoned. What did you find when you went there? Nothing, Mr. Clayton said, his voice filled with anger. I went to the address and knocked, but no one answered. I even looked around the building. There was no sign of anyone. Just a locked door and that damn note saying the guild had disbanded. It's like they never existed at all. It's maddening. Grayson, however, seemed more intrigued than frustrated. He sat back again, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The fact that the office was abandoned is significant. Someone went to great lengths to erase all traces of the guild. But why? What was so important that they would go to such extreme measures? I was beginning to understand the layers of complexity that Grayson was unraveling. This wasn't just a case of a missing organization. It was a case of something much more sinister. The disappearance of the Red-Faced Guild was no accident. It had been carefully orchestrated. Grayson turned to me. Nathaniel, what do you make of the note that Clayton found on the door? The Red-Faced Guild is no longer in operation. Do not attempt to contact us. What do you think that means? I thought for a moment before responding. It sounds like a warning. Whoever was behind the guild didn't want anyone asking questions. They wanted to make sure that the guild's activities remained a secret. Exactly, Grayson said, his voice filled with certainty. The guild was never meant to last. It was a temporary operation, a front for something else. And now, with the guild gone, the people behind it don't want to risk anyone discovering the truth. I felt a chill run down my spine. What? Do you think they were really after Grayson? What was the guild hiding? Grayson stood up, his eyes gleaming with excitement. That's what we need to find out. We're missing the most important part of the puzzle, Nathaniel. The why. Why? Did they hire Mr. Clayton and others like him? What was the end goal? He turned to Mr. Clayton. I need you to think carefully, Mr. Clayton. Did you notice anything unusual during your time working at the guild's office? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Mr. Clayton hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. Nothing that stood out. But now that you mention it, there was one thing that always struck me as odd. Every time I went to the office, the building next door seemed to be empty. There were no lights, no movement. It was like no one ever lived there, but it was always locked up tight. Grayson's eyes lit up. Now that's a very important detail. The building next door. What if that was the real location of the guild's operations? What if the office was just a front, and the real work was happening next door, hidden from view? I was beginning to see the outline of the mystery coming into focus. The more we uncovered, the more I realized that the red-faced guild was no ordinary organization. There was something much darker at play here, something that was being carefully hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Grayson smiled, a glint of triumph in his eyes. We're getting closer, Nathaniel. I think we have enough information to move forward. It's time to start digging deeper, literally and figuratively. I nodded, my mind buzzing with anticipation. This case was no longer just about an odd job gone wrong. It was about uncovering a hidden truth, one that had been carefully buried for reasons we could only begin to imagine. And with Grayson leading the way, I had no doubt that we would uncover whatever it was, no matter how deeply it was hidden. Chapter 4. The Red-Faced Guild. The more we delved into the mystery of the Red-Faced Guild, the more curious and perplexing the case became. After our initial discussions, Grayson had decided that we needed to explore every possible lead, no matter how small. He was methodical in his approach, never leaving anything to chance, and I could see that this case was starting to truly intrigue him. The strange, almost absurd nature of the guild, that it only accepted men with red hair and paid them well for an incredibly simple task, was, as Grayson had pointed out, a red flag. There had to be something more behind this strange recruitment process, and it was our job to figure out what that was. As we sat in the parlor, Grayson turned to Mr. Clayton, who was looking increasingly anxious. "Mr. Clayton, you mentioned that Duncan Ross was the only person you dealt with at the office. Did he ever mention anything about the origins of the Red-Faced Guild? Any clue as to why it exists or who started it?" Mr. Clayton scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable. "No, not really. Ross was always vague about the Guild's purpose. He'd just tell me that the Guild was there to help men like me, those of us with red hair. He was always quick to change the subject whenever I asked any questions about the Guild's founder or its goals. He was an odd man, always rushing around, never giving straight answers." Grayson leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in thought. A man like Ross would never be the mastermind behind such an operation. He was a cog in the wheel, just one part of a larger plan. We need to think about who could have set this up. A group with enough resources to create such a strange and secretive operation. I looked at Mr. Clayton, still piecing together the clues. "What else can you tell us about Ross? Did he ever bring anyone else into the office? Any visitors?" Clayton seemed to recall something. "No, never. The office was always empty, except for me and Ross. But now that you mention it, there was always a lot of activity in the building across the street. It looked like it was being watched. People would come and go at odd hours, and there was a man I saw once who would often peek around the corner, just standing there, watching the office. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I realize it could have been someone connected to the Guild." Grayson's eyes flickered with excitement. "That's valuable information. It sounds like that building across the street could be a key location. I'm willing to bet that's where the true operation of the Guild was happening, not in the small office where you worked." Mr. Clayton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But why? Why would they need a secret operation? What were they really doing?" Grayson gave him a reassuring smile. "We don't know yet, Mr. Clayton, but we're getting closer." I looked at Grayson, his expression serious. "You think the Guild was a front for something else, don't you?" "Of course," Grayson replied, tapping his fingers against the table. "That's why the Guild seemed so pointless. Copying encyclopedias, hiring men with red hair. It doesn't add up. There had to be another reason. Something hidden from plain sight." I nodded in agreement. "So, what do we do next?" Grayson stood up, his gaze fixed on the door as if a new thought had just entered his mind. "We need to go to that building across the street. We'll start there and see what we can find. If there's anything suspicious, we'll follow up immediately." But for now, it's time to take action. The urgency in his voice made it clear that he was already planning his next move, and there was no time to waste. Grayson grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he prepared for whatever lay ahead. Mr. Clayton, though still somewhat unsure of what was going to happen, stood up as well, eager to follow Grayson's lead. The three of us walked briskly to the address Mr. Clayton had mentioned, across the street from the red-faced guild's office. It was a building that seemed out of place, a dull gray structure that stood in stark contrast to the otherwise bustling street. The windows were shuttered, and the front door had a heavy lock on it. But there was something about it that seemed off. It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the sense of isolation that surrounded it. No one walked by. The air felt heavy, as if the building was hiding something. Grayson studied the building intently, his gaze piercing. He moved toward the side of the building, circling it carefully, with Clayton and I following closely behind. As we moved, I couldn't help but notice how still everything was. The street, usually full of life, felt unusually quiet. "Nothing's happened here in years," Clayton muttered as he looked at the boarded-up windows. "At least that's what I thought." Grayson nodded, his sharp mind already working. The fact that this building hasn't been used in a while is part of the puzzle. It's not abandoned. It's being purposefully kept hidden. As we rounded the corner of the building, Grayson's eyes caught something. A small, almost imperceptible gap in the wall where the bricks didn't quite line up. He leaned closer, inspecting it carefully, and then, without hesitation, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small crowbar. "This is it," Grayson muttered, his face lighting up with the thrill of discovery. This gap in the wall isn't just a coincidence. Let's see what's behind it. With a quick, practiced motion, Grayson wedged the crowbar into the crack and began to pull. The wall creaked as it shifted, and a moment later, a hidden door was revealed. It was concealed so well that even the most observant passerby would never have noticed it. I gasped. "What do you think is inside?" Grayson smiled, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Whatever it is, Nathaniel, it's exactly what we've been looking for." He pushed open the door, and the three of us stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with dust, but there was something electric about the atmosphere. It was as if the room we had just entered had been waiting for us, its secrets ready to be uncovered. The space was filled with old crates, stacks of paper, and various objects that looked like they had been left behind in a hurry. As we moved deeper into the room, we could see a large metal safe embedded into the wall. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just an abandoned office. It was a storage facility for something far more valuable. Grayson walked over to the safe and examined it closely. He then turned to Mr. Clayton and me, a knowing smile on his face. This is it. The heart of the red-faced guild. Whatever was going on here, it's all hidden behind this door. But the safe was locked, and Grayson didn't have the key. It was clear that whatever was inside was of immense value, and it was being kept under tight security. Grayson's eyes gleamed as he took in the scene. Now we're getting somewhere. But this isn't the end of it. We'll have to dig deeper. This safe holds the answers we've been looking for. As the reality of the situation began to set in, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to uncover. The red-faced guild had clearly been a cover for something much larger, something far more dangerous. And now, Grayson was about to expose it. "Mr. Clayton," Grayson said, turning to our companion, "you've been a great help, but I think we're at the point where we need to take this further. You may want to stay back for a while as we finish up here." Mr. Clayton nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course, Grayson. I just want to know what's going on. I don't want to be part of anything dangerous, but I need to know the truth." Grayson gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You'll get your answers. I promise you that." With that, Grayson turned back to the safe, his mind already racing with possibilities. The red-faced guild, whatever it truly was about to be revealed. And the secrets hidden within that safe would tell us everything we needed to know. As we stood in the darkened room, the weight of the mystery pressing down on us, one thing was clear. We had only scratched the surface. The true purpose of the red-faced guild was still hidden, but we were getting closer to uncovering it, one clue at a time. Chapter 5. The Strange Advertisement. The discovery of the hidden room in the building across from the red-faced guild's office had only deepened the mystery. And now, standing in the dimly lit space filled with old crates and boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of uncovering something enormous. The safe, locked tightly against prying eyes, seemed to hold the answers we needed. But Grayson was not one to rush. He was careful, precise, and methodical. We needed more pieces of the puzzle before we could make our next move. As Grayson examined the safe one last time, his mind racing with theories, I turned to Mr. Clayton, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, still processing everything that had happened so far. The fear of the unknown was evident in his expression, But it was clear he was also desperate to understand what had gone wrong with the guild and what his part in it all had been. "I can't believe it," Clayton muttered, shaking his head. "I thought it was just a silly job. Something harmless. But this is far more serious than I ever imagined." Grayson, without taking his eyes off the safe, nodded. "Yes, Mr. Clayton, it's much more serious than we thought. But we're not quite there yet. There's one last piece of the puzzle that we need to look at. The advertisement." I glanced at Grayson, confused. "The advertisement? What do you mean?" "The red-faced guild advertised itself through a very specific method, a personal ad in the newspaper. And that ad is likely the key to understanding what this was really all about," Grayson explained, his voice steady and calm. "We need to track down the exact wording of that ad." I immediately understood. The ad had been the catalyst for everything. It had led Mr. Clayton to the guild in the first place, and it was likely written to draw in exactly the right type of man, those with fiery red hair. Grayson had a theory, but he needed to see the advertisement for himself. Clayton nodded slowly. "I've still got the old paper at home, the one with the ad in it. I never threw it out. It's been in my drawer for weeks ever since I first saw it." Grayson's eyes lit up. "Perfect. We need to go there right now. The details in that ad may help us understand what we're truly dealing with." The three of us made our way back to Mr. Clayton's shop, where he led us inside and immediately retrieved the old newspaper from a drawer behind the counter. The paper was yellowed with age, and the edges were slightly torn, evidence of the time that had passed since it was first folded away. Clayton unfolded it carefully and spread it across the counter, revealing the advertisement that had started it all. Grayson leaned over the paper, his eyes scanning the lines with intense concentration. I stood beside him, trying to make sense of the words on the page. The ad was written in a bold, blocky font, as if it were meant to stand out among all the other announcements. It read, "Red-Headed League. Man needed for new job. Salary £4. All week. Only men with red hair need apply. Must be available for an office-based job. Come to Red-Headed League offices, 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, London at 11 o'clock Monday morning. Duncan Ross, Secretary." Grayson read the ad once, then twice. He didn't speak for a few moments, which made the silence in the room feel heavier. When he finally broke the quiet, his voice was measured but full of excitement. "This is it. This is the key." I looked at him, still trying to make sense of what I had just read. "What's so important about this? It's just an ad for a job, right?" Grayson smiled, but it wasn't the usual smile I was accustomed to seeing. This one was more calculated, knowing. Nathaniel, this is no ordinary job advertisement. The phrasing, the details, it all points to something much bigger than a simple office job. £4 a week is a generous salary for the time, far more than most men could hope to earn. And the fact that they specified only men with red hair need apply tells us that there was something much more particular about this selection process. He turned to Mr. Clayton. Did you notice anything unusual about the ad when you first saw it? Clayton looked at the paper, his brow furrowed in thought. At the time, I just thought it was a quirky offer. I didn't think much about it, honestly. But now that you mention it, I remember that it struck me as odd. Why would they only want men with red hair? I thought it was a strange request, but the money was too good to pass up. Grayson nodded, as if he had been expecting that answer. Exactly. The guild wasn't just looking for workers. It was selecting individuals for a very specific reason, and the red hair wasn't a mere coincidence. There's something deeply symbolic about it, something hidden behind the obvious. I felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together, but I wasn't yet sure what the full picture looked like. Grayson, however, seemed to have already started connecting the dots. This ad was the first part of their recruitment process, he continued. It was designed to target a very particular group of men, those with red hair. But there's more. This location, Pope's Court, Fleet Street, was not a random choice. Fleet Street is located in a part of London known for its rich history in banking and commerce, and it's also near some of the wealthiest areas in the city. This wasn't just a random office in a back alley. It was a well-thought-out location. Mr. Clayton, his face growing more serious, nodded. I never thought about it like that. At the time, I didn't care much about the location. I just wanted to make sure I was getting paid. Grayson smiled slightly, as if he had just unearthed another clue. That's the trick. They wanted men like you to think it was just a simple job. But in reality, it was a setup. This wasn't about copying encyclopedias. It was about gathering a group of red-haired men who could be used for something else entirely. I raised an eyebrow. You think this was some kind of secret operation? Grayson's eyes sparkled with clarity. Yes, Nathaniel. And I'm beginning to think that the Red-Headed League wasn't just a front. It was a recruitment tool for something much more sinister. They needed the men with red hair for a reason. A very specific, calculated reason. He turned back to the advertisement and began to trace his finger along the edges of the paper. This ad is the first clue we have that points to the true purpose of the guild, and the fact that Duncan Ross was the secretary. He was just a figurehead. There was someone else pulling the strings. I looked at the ad again, trying to see what Grayson saw. The strange advertisement, the mysterious secretary, the odd requirement for red hair. It was all starting to feel like a carefully constructed puzzle. Grayson stepped away from the counter and began pacing the room. Now we need to figure out what this office-based job really entailed. What were these men really doing? Why were they gathered there every day? And what was the end game? We know that the Red-Headed League wasn't just a job. It was a cover for something far more dangerous. We need to find out what that was. His words hung in the air as we stood there, the weight of the mystery settling heavily on our shoulders. The advertisement had led us here, but it was only the beginning of a much deeper and darker story. As Grayson turned to us, his face serious, I knew that this case was far from over. The Red-Headed Guild, whatever its true purpose was, had only just begun to reveal its secrets, and we were determined to uncover them, no matter how many layers of deception we had to peel back. Chapter 6. Vincent Spalding, the Assistant. The moment Grayson's mind settled on the next clue, there was no hesitation. He had a knack for seeing patterns that no one else could, and he wasted no time in pivoting our attention to Mr. Clayton's assistant, Vincent Spalding. We had learned a great deal about the red-faced guild, but now we needed to learn more about the people who had been part of it, especially someone so close to Clayton's operation. If there was anyone who might hold the answers we needed, it was Spalding. Vincent Spalding was not just any ordinary assistant. According to Clayton, Spalding was an intelligent, capable man with a keen work ethic that seemed to extend beyond just the mundane tasks of running the shop. He had an air of quiet confidence about him, so much so that he had been trusted with Clayton's business in his absence. He worked long hours, developed a passion for photography, and spent countless hours in the basement developing his photos. His commitment to the job, despite being underpaid, made him stand out. It was clear that he was no average assistant. Grayson was particularly intrigued by one detail Clayton had shared: Spalding's obsession with photography. It seemed trivial at first, but to Grayson, it was another piece of the puzzle. Another clue that could help us understand the man, and perhaps his true role in the mysterious events unfolding around us. We need to know more about this man. Spalding, Grayson said as he paced the room, his voice low with thought. He's been working closely with Mr. Clayton for months now, and there's a good chance he knows more than he's letting on. It's possible he's not the simple assistant we think he is. We need to examine him closely. Mr. Clayton, visibly uneasy, shifted in his seat. Spalding's always been a good worker, but I never thought to question him. He's a bit odd, sure, but then again, aren't we all? I just thought he had a passion for photography. That's all. Grayson stopped pacing and turned his gaze directly on Clayton. It's not just the photography, Mr. Clayton. The fact that Spalding spent so much time in the basement is what intrigues me. Why did he need to spend so many hours down there? And why did he never mention anything about the strange occurrences in your shop? Clayton's eyes widened with understanding, but still he seemed hesitant. What do you mean? He was just developing pictures. It was his hobby. Precisely, Grayson said, his voice tinged with a sharp clarity. His hobby. What better way to spend hours at a time in a place no one else could see? What if he was doing something more than developing photos? What if he was working on something that could explain the red-faced guild and the bizarre nature of this whole case? I could see that Clayton was beginning to feel the weight of Grayson's words. Spalding, who had always seemed like a trustworthy assistant, now seemed to be a central figure in the case. We needed to dig deeper. Grayson looked at me. Nathaniel, we need to visit the shop's basement. There's no time to waste. The answer might be hidden there. As we entered Clayton's shop once again, I couldn't help but notice how different it felt this time. It wasn't just a place of business anymore. It had transformed into something mysterious, something dark. The shelves were lined with goods and trinkets, and the faint smell of ink and wood lingered in the air. But the basement, there was something about it that felt unsettling. Clayton led us to the staircase, and with a sigh, he began to descend. First, followed by Grayson, and then me. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging overhead. The stone walls were cold, and the air felt damp. It was a place where no one ever ventured, except for Vincent Spalding. As I looked around the room, I could see evidence of Spalding's photography obsession. A large, old-fashioned, developing tank sat in one corner, and several prints were drying on lines strung across the room. But as my eyes scanned the space, they were drawn to something far more interesting. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was a large, wooden crate. It seemed out of place in the otherwise cluttered basement. The crate was old, its wood warped and scratched. There was a peculiar symbol etched into one side, an intricate design of interwoven lines that looked almost deliberate. Grayson noticed the crate at the same moment I did. His eyes narrowed as he moved toward it with purpose. "That's strange," he murmured under his breath. That doesn't belong here. I approached the crate cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Spalding have been hiding in a crate like this? A sudden thought struck me. This was no ordinary box. It was something far more significant, something that could potentially tie Spalding to the strange events that had been unfolding. I looked at Grayson, and he nodded, understanding my unspoken thought. "Let's open it," Grayson said, his voice firm. "We need to see what's inside." The moment Grayson lifted the lid of the crate, a musty smell filled the air. Inside were several stacks of old papers, bound together with thick string. The papers were yellowed with age, and the ink appeared to be fading. But as we flipped through the first few pages, the contents were unmistakable. These were detailed blueprints. I turned a page, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a series of drawings depicting tunnels. The tunnels ran beneath the city, snaking through various locations. There were lines drawn to specific buildings, including Clayton's shop and, curiously, the building we had explored earlier across the street. "This isn't just a set of plans," Grayson said, his voice low and intense. "These are the designs for a tunnel system. Spalding. He wasn't just a photographer, was he?" I shook my head, the truth dawning on me like a cold chill. He was digging tunnels. He was digging a way out, through the very building next door. Grayson glanced over at Clayton. "You said you never noticed anything strange, Mr. Clayton. What if I told you that Spalding was using your basement to dig a tunnel to the bank across the street? What if the photography was just a cover for his real activities?" Clayton's face drained of color. "What? No, that can't be. Spalding? But he's just an assistant. He couldn't be involved in anything like that." Grayson's eyes were sharp, and his tone was unwavering. "Mr. Clayton, your assistant, Vincent Spalding, is at the center of this scheme. He's been using your trust in your business to carry out activities that go far beyond simple photography. This whole setup, the red-faced guild, the job offer, the mysterious disappearance of the guild, it's all a cover for something much bigger. Spalding has been digging a tunnel, and I suspect that it leads directly to the vaults of the city's bank." The weight of Grayson's words hung heavily in the air. Clayton was speechless, his mind still trying to process the bombshell that had just been dropped. But it was clear now. Vincent Spalding was no mere assistant. He was a key player in a much larger and far more dangerous plot. I looked around the basement, my mind racing with the implications of what we had just uncovered. The blueprints, the hidden crate, the tunnels, all of it pointed to something. criminal, something dangerous. And Spalding, the quiet assistant, was at the heart of it all. Grayson stood up, his face grim. "We need to find Spalding, Nathaniel. We've uncovered enough to know that he's deeply involved in whatever scheme this is. And if I'm right, he's not far from carrying out his plan." I nodded, my pulse quickening. The mystery was far from over. In fact, we were just getting started. "Let's go," Grayson said, determination in his voice. "It's time to stop Spalding before it's too late." Chapter 7. The End of the Guild. The discovery of the blueprints in Vincent Spalding's hidden crate had been a game changer. We were no longer chasing shadows or vague suspicions. The path was clear now. Spalding had been constructing a tunnel, and that tunnel led directly to a bank vault, right under Mr. Clayton's nose. The red-faced guild was not what it seemed. It wasn't a mere job offering, nor was it just a way to bring red-haired men together for some obscure purpose. It was a carefully orchestrated plan, a ruse to keep men like Clayton busy, while Spalding and his accomplices worked on their true objective, a heist of unimaginable proportions. I could see the realization hit Mr. Clayton like a wave. His face, which had once been full of confusion and fear, now showed signs of guilt. He was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of a nearby table. He had trusted Spalding. He had allowed him into his home, into his life, and now he felt betrayed. "I never saw it," Clayton said in a voice full of regret. "I thought he was just a man who loved photography, who wanted to make a living doing something he was passionate about. I never thought he'd be involved in something like this. I didn't know." Grayson, as always, remained calm, his mind focused on the task at hand. "Mr. Clayton, the fact that you didn't know doesn't change the reality of the situation. But now we need to stop this before it's too late. Spalding is working with someone, possibly more than one person, and they're planning a robbery. The tunnel system they've been constructing is the key to their escape." Clayton nodded, his eyes downcast. "I can't believe it. This is all happening right under my roof. I thought I was doing the right thing by giving him work, but now I see—" Grayson interrupted gently. "You couldn't have known. The blame lies with Spalding, not you. Now, we have to focus on stopping him." We quickly made our way back to the building across the street, where the tunnel had likely been completed. Grayson moved with a quiet urgency, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. We couldn't waste any time. The robbery was most likely planned for tonight. Spalding and his accomplices would use the tunnel to reach the bank vaults and escape before anyone could. "Stop them. Stay close," Grayson said, his voice low. "We don't know how many people are involved in this. We can't afford to be seen or caught off guard." We reached the building without incident. Grayson wasted no time. He led the way, his steps steady and purposeful. As we entered the building through the hidden door, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet everything was. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet sounded like a warning. "This is it," Grayson whispered, "the heart of their operation. The place where everything comes together." We crept through the narrow hallways, avoiding any unnecessary noise. The smell of old wood and dampness hung in the air. But there was something else, too. An unmistakable tension, as if something dangerous was just around the corner. Finally, Grayson led us to a door at the far end of the hallway. The door was heavy, made of solid oak, and it creaked slightly when Grayson pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, but there was enough light to reveal the sight of a large metal safe embedded into the wall. The safe was massive, its locks and bolts gleaming in the dim light. Grayson's expression was unreadable as he moved closer to the safe. "This is it, the heart of the heist. They've been planning this for months. This safe contains the stolen gold, and they'll be using the tunnel to transport it. We're running out of time." We moved quietly, each of us aware that this was the point of no return. The tunnel, the blueprints, the secretive activities, all of it had led us here. The bank's gold was within their reach, and it was only a matter of time before Spalding and his accomplices made their move. Grayson's eyes flickered toward the far corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was Spalding. The sight of him in person, standing there watching us, made my blood run cold. He wasn't just some eager assistant. He was the mastermind behind it all, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now his plan was close to coming to fruition. "Well, well," Spalding said, his voice smooth and calm. "It looks like you've figured it out, Grayson. But I'm afraid it's too late. The game's already over." Grayson didn't flinch. He was never one to show emotion, and even now, with everything hanging in the balance, he remained composed. "Spalding," Grayson said, his voice steady, "we know everything. We know about the tunnel, the safe, and your little guild. It's over. You're not getting away with this." Spalding chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "You're right about one thing. It's over. But not in the way you think. See, this wasn't about the money, the gold, the robbery. It was all a means to an end. It was never the real prize. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of Spalding's words. What did he mean? What was the end goal? Spalding's grin widened as he took a step forward, revealing the full scope of his plan. You see, Grayson, this wasn't just a heist. It was a distraction, a way to keep everyone occupied while my associates moved in on something far more valuable. Grayson's expression hardened. What are you talking about? Spalding gestured to the large metal safe. That safe contains more than just gold. It contains the key to a larger operation, one that has been years in the making. While you were busy following your clues, we've been setting up something much bigger. The red-faced guild? Just a front. The real operation was happening right here, beneath your nose. I took a step closer to Grayson. What is it? What's in the safe? Spalding's eyes gleamed. The key to the bank's vaults. The entire system of tunnels I built leads to more than just one vault. It leads to multiple locations, all connected to the underground network that controls the city's financial flow. The gold was just a way to cover our tracks. But now, the real prize is within our grasp. Grayson stepped forward, his voice low but filled with authority. You've underestimated us, Spalding. You thought you could escape with the loot, but you won't get away. The police are already on their way, and we've got everything we need to stop you. Spalding's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. You think you can stop me? You're too late. The pieces are already in motion. The red-faced guild was never about the gold. It was always about control. The city's financial control. At that moment, I realized the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a plot to manipulate the financial system itself. Spalding had orchestrated a massive scheme, using Clayton's shop and the guild as a cover, all while plotting to gain access to the city's most secure vaults. Grayson, however, was always 2 steps ahead. The police will be here soon, Spalding. You're finished. Your plan has unraveled. As Spalding's face turned from cocky confidence to desperation, I knew that the end of the red-faced guild was near. Grayson had outsmarted him at every turn. Spalding's web of lies, the hidden tunnels, the guild, it was all falling apart. Within minutes, the sound of approaching police sirens filled the air. Spalding's expression changed. He knew his time was up. As the officers rushed into the room, Spalding made one last desperate move, but it was too late. He was swiftly apprehended, his plot thwarted. Grayson stood silently, his gaze steady. The red-faced guild was finally over, its mysteries unraveled, its dangerous ambitions halted. We had stopped them, just in time. "Well done, Nathaniel," Grayson said as he turned to me. "We've brought the curtain down on the red-faced guild. But remember, this case was never about just one man. It was a network, an organization of many, all working toward a common goal. But tonight, we put an end to it." As the police led Spalding away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The case was closed. The red-faced guild had been dismantled, and for the first time in a long while, I knew that justice had been served. Chapter 8. Grayson's Plan. The dust had barely settled after our confrontation with Spalding, and the adrenaline still surged through my veins as I tried to process everything that had unfolded in the past few hours. The red-faced guild, the secretive organization that had recruited men with red hair for a bizarre office job, had turned out to be nothing more than a front for a much more dangerous operation. Spalding, whom I had once considered an innocent assistant, had been the mastermind behind the entire scheme, using Clayton's shop as a cover for digging a tunnel to the bank vaults beneath the city. His plan to manipulate the financial system and orchestrate a massive heist had been foiled, but it was clear from his smug demeanor that he had a backup plan, a contingency in case something went wrong. As the police took Spalding away, Grayson remained composed, his eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. He seemed unaffected by the chaos that had just erupted around us, his mind already moving toward the next phase of the investigation. It was clear to me that Grayson wasn't satisfied with merely uncovering the plot. He was already planning his next move. "Grayson," I said, trying to catch up with his thoughts. "What's next? We've stopped Spalding and his scheme, but something about all of this feels unfinished. I can't shake the feeling that there's more going on here than just a heist." Grayson looked up from his quiet contemplation, his eyes narrowing, thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right, Nathaniel. We've stopped Spalding and his immediate plans, but the real question is, who else was involved, and how deep does this network go?" I had been so focused on Spalding that I hadn't fully considered the broader implications of this case. The red-faced guild, the tunnels, and the stolen gold were only pieces of a much larger puzzle. Grayson was right. We had to dig deeper to understand the full scope of the operation and uncover the true masterminds behind it. Spalding may have been the face of the operation, Grayson continued, but there's more to this than just one man. The tunnel system, the blueprints, the hidden agendas. It's clear that a group of people have been involved in this for a long time, and we haven't even begun to uncover who those people are. I watched as Grayson's gaze sharpened, his mind clearly working at full speed. We need to understand the full extent of the operation. We need to know how far back this goes and who else has been pulling the strings. I nodded, eager to see where Grayson would take us next. What's your plan then? How do we find out who's behind all of this? Grayson's expression grew serious, and he walked over to the table where the blueprints of the tunnels were still spread out. He ran his fingers over the diagrams, tracing the intricate network of passageways that Spalding had carefully planned. "The tunnels are the key," Grayson said, his voice steady, but filled with determination. The reason Spalding was so focused on building them was not just for access to the bank's vaults. No, there's a much bigger reason. These tunnels were the infrastructure for a larger, more far-reaching plan. The people behind this operation were using the tunnels as a way to connect various locations throughout the city, possibly even across the country. They were moving more than just gold. They were moving information, resources, and people. Took a step closer to the blueprints, my mind racing to catch up with Grayson's theory. "You think they were using the tunnels to smuggle something else? Something more valuable than gold?" Grayson nodded. "Exactly. The gold was a distraction. The real value was in what could be transported undetected through the tunnels. Think about it. Banks, governments, powerful organizations, they all rely on information. And if you can control the flow of information, you control everything." Spalding and his group were attempting to establish a secret network that could infiltrate and manipulate financial and political systems without anyone ever noticing. I felt the weight of his words settle in. It wasn't just a robbery. It was an attempt to control the flow of the city's entire economic system. Perhaps even the country's. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how dangerous this plot had been. If left unchecked, Spalding and his network could have brought the entire city, maybe even the entire country, to its knees. Grayson turned to me, his face set in grim determination. "We need to act fast. There's no telling how many people are involved in this. And if we don't stop them now, they could scatter and continue their operation elsewhere. We need to find out who's funding this network and who else is involved." I could see the fire in Grayson's eyes. The same fire that had driven him to solve countless cases before. He wasn't just going to let this go. It was personal now. "We need to take down the entire network," Grayson said firmly. "That means going after the people behind it, the financiers, the ones pulling the strings. And we need to do it quietly, before they realize what we're doing." I nodded in agreement. "So, what's the first step?" Grayson smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "First, we need to dig into the financial records. Someone must be funding this operation, and I'm certain there are traces of it. We need to find out who's been backing Spalding and his group. Once we have that, we can track down their connections. I had worked with Grayson long enough to know that when he set his sights on a goal, nothing could stop him. He had a plan, and it was already set into motion. He turned to Clayton, who had been standing silently by the door, his face still etched with confusion and concern. "Mr. Clayton," Grayson said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've been a part of this in a way you never intended. I know. This is difficult for you, but we need your help. You have connections in the city, and we need access to some of the financial records you've kept. I suspect that these records could lead us to the individuals behind this operation." Clayton seemed to hesitate for a moment, still processing the enormity of what had transpired. But after a beat, he nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll help however I can. I owe you that much." Grayson gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. "We'll need to act quickly. The more time we give them, the more they'll have to cover their tracks. We have to stay one step ahead." With that, Grayson turned to me, his eyes now filled with a steely determination. "Let's get to work. We'll start by tracing the money. Once we know where it's coming from, we can follow the trail to the people who have been funding this operation. And when we find them, we'll bring them down." I could see that Grayson was already putting his plan into motion. Every piece of the puzzle, every clue, was falling into place, and I knew that if anyone could bring down this network, it would be him. We gathered the financial records and set off to follow the money, knowing that the next steps would be crucial in unraveling the full extent of Spalding's plot. This wasn't just about a stolen gold shipment. It was about a system of control, of power, that had been lurking beneath the surface. But with Grayson at the helm, we were determined to stop it before it could do any more damage. As we made our way through the city's underbelly, the weight of our mission pressed down on me. We were up against something far bigger than a simple criminal syndicate. We were facing a network of power and influence that could change the course of history itself. And with every passing moment, I knew that we were getting closer to uncovering the truth and to putting an end to this dangerous game once and for all. Chapter 9. The Bank Heist. The tension in the air was palpable as Grayson, Clayton, and I made our way through the narrow alley behind the building. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the mystery pressing down on me. The more we uncovered, the more dangerous the situation seemed. Spalding had been playing a far more intricate game than we had initially realized, and now, Everything was converging on one crucial moment: the heist. Grayson's mind worked like clockwork, and he wasn't one to leave things to chance. He had been planning for this night for weeks, anticipating that the moment would come when Spalding would make his move. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an attack on the financial infrastructure of the entire city. As we reached the back entrance of the city's main bank, Grayson paused and turned to Clayton. "Stay here, Mr. Clayton," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We'll need you to keep watch. If anything goes wrong, we need you to alert the authorities." Clayton nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I understand. I'll do whatever I can, but I still can't believe it's come to this. My assistant, Spalding, was always so trustworthy. I never imagined he was capable of something like this." Grayson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You weren't the only one fooled, Mr. Clayton. We all were. But now, it's time to stop him." With that, Grayson and I turned, making our way to the front of the bank. The night was eerily quiet. The streets almost deserted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the steady echo of our footsteps on the pavement. As we reached the front of the bank, Grayson pulled out a small folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a detailed map of the bank, showing the vaults, the guard, stations, and the hidden passageways that led to the bank's underground system. We had studied it thoroughly, and everything was in place for us to execute the plan. Grayson looked over the map one last time before folding it neatly and slipping it back into his pocket. His eyes were sharp, scanning every inch of the building, as if he could anticipate the slightest movement inside. "We'll need to move quickly," Grayson said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "Spalding and his accomplices are probably already inside, setting up. We'll have no more than an hour to stop them before they make their escape." I nodded, my heart racing as we made our way to the side of the building. The back entrance, where the tunnel system began, was just around the corner. Grayson paused once more, his gaze steady as he checked his pocket watch. "It's almost time," he muttered under his breath. "Once we're inside, we'll split up. I'll head to the vault. You stay close and cover the entrance. If anyone tries to escape through the back, you stop them." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. This was no longer just about a stolen shipment of gold. This was a battle to protect the integrity of the city's financial system. A single mistake could mean disaster. Grayson gave me a small, reassuring smile before turning toward the door. We had prepared for this moment, but the reality of what we were about to face made it all feel very real. This was a heist that could change everything. As Grayson and I slipped into the darkened interior of the bank, the quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. The vaults were just a few steps away, but there was no time to waste. We had to move fast. I could see the outline of the vault door ahead, and I knew that Spalding's team would be close. They had planned this for weeks, and now it was up to us to stop them. We reached the first set of security doors, and Grayson quickly pressed his ear to the door, listening for any signs of movement. After a moment, he nodded, signaling for us to move forward. With a quiet click, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The path to the vault was clear, but I could hear faint sounds in the distance. Footsteps, the low murmur of voices. They were here. Spalding and his team were already inside. We moved through the darkened corridors with purpose, every step calculated and deliberate. Grayson's every move was precise, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his mind running, multiple calculations at once. This was what he did best. Think 3 steps ahead of everyone else. As we approached the vault door, we heard a faint sound, a soft scrape of metal on metal. I motioned for Grayson to stop, and we crouched down behind a stack of crates, waiting. Through the small crack in the door, I saw the figure of Spalding standing near the vault, his back to us. He was holding something, a large metal device, and he appeared to be working on the vault's intricate lock mechanism. Grayson's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for me to move in closer. We had to act now before Spalding could complete his task. "On 3, Grayson whispered. 1, 2, 3. With a swift motion, Grayson lunged forward, knocking the device out of Spalding's hands. Spalding spun around in shock, his face paling as he saw us. "Grayson," Spalding sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should have stayed out of this. It's too late. You've missed your chance." Grayson didn't hesitate. "It's never too late, Spalding. You're done." Before Spalding could react, Grayson expertly grabbed him by the arm, twisting him around and slamming him against the vault wall. Spalding let out a gasp of pain, but his smug grin remained. "You think you've won?" Spalding laughed, his voice low. "You have no idea what's really going on. You're too late to stop it. The plan is already in motion." I stepped forward, my heart racing. "What do you mean? What plan?" Spalding's grin only widened. "You think the gold is what matters? It's not. It was just a distraction. A way to keep you busy while we put the real plan in motion." "I was never after the gold, Grayson. I'm after something far more powerful." Grayson's expression darkened. "What are you talking about, Spalding?" Spalding's laugh echoed through the vault room as he tried to break free from Grayson's hold. "It's too late, Grayson. Too late to stop it. The money, the gold. It's all just a way to fund a much bigger operation. And now it's in motion. You'll never stop it." Grayson tightened his grip on Spalding's arm. "We'll see about that. The only thing that's in motion now is your arrest." Just then, the door to the vault flew open with a loud crash, and two more figures appeared in the doorway, armed and ready for a fight. They were part of Spalding's crew, but they were too late. Grayson was already one step ahead. Now, "Nathaniel!" Grayson shouted. I lunged forward, tackling one of the intruders to the ground. The other raised his weapon, but Grayson moved with the precision of a master, disarming the second man with a swift move. The fight was over in moments. The two criminals were quickly subdued and tied up, while Spalding stood there, defeated, but still defiant. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the silent alarm Grayson had triggered earlier. Spalding's team was taken into custody, and the vaults were secured. As Grayson and I stood in the dimly lit vault, the weight of the night's events began to sink in. We had stopped Spalding, but it was clear that this wasn't the end of the story. His network ran deeper than we had realized, and the repercussions of this heist would be felt for years to come. "We've stopped the robbery," Grayson said, his voice calm but filled with satisfaction. "But there's still much more to uncover. Spalding wasn't working alone. This is just the beginning." I nodded, the enormity of the case beginning to unfold in my mind. The heist had been stopped, but the war for control of the city's financial system was far from over. The red-faced guild had only been a small part of the larger conspiracy, and with Grayson's plan now in motion, I knew that the next chapter in this dark story was just beginning. Chapter 10. The Mastermind Revealed. The heist was over. The vault had been secured, the robbers apprehended, and Spalding, the once trusted assistant, was now in police custody. Yet, as I stood in the dimly lit vault, the weight of the entire operation still lingered in the air. Despite all that we had uncovered, Spalding's role in the red-faced guild, the tunnel system, the gold, it was clear that there was still one crucial piece missing: the mastermind behind the entire operation. We had seen Spalding's defiance, but he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Grayson, as always, had been 3 steps ahead. Even as the police took Spalding and his accomplices away, Grayson's mind was still racing, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any last-minute clues. There was something more, something deeper that we hadn't uncovered yet. I could feel it in the air. This case wasn't over. As the officers wrapped up their work and began to clear the bank, Grayson turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Nathaniel, we've stopped the immediate danger, but we haven't stopped the real threat. There's someone else involved in all of this. Someone who's been orchestrating everything from the shadows." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "You're saying that Spalding wasn't the mastermind?" Grayson shook his head. "No. Spalding was a pawn in a much larger game. He was just the one who got his hands dirty. The real mastermind is still out there, pulling the strings. And we need to find him before he vanishes into the night." I nodded, my pulse quickening. This case had already taken us into the depths of a criminal conspiracy. But now, we were facing the shadowy figure who had been running the show from behind the scenes. The true face of the red-faced guild was still unknown to us. The next few hours were spent piecing together the evidence we had gathered: spreadsheets, financial records, and blueprints of the tunnels, every piece of the puzzle we had uncovered so far. But it wasn't enough. Spalding had been the public face, the one who interacted with Clayton, the one who was seen in the bank, but he had never acted alone. Grayson stood at the window of the bank's office, staring out into the night. His eyes were distant, his mind clearly working at full speed. I could see the gears turning behind his calm exterior. Then, without warning, he turned to me, his eyes sharp and filled with revelation. "Nathaniel, I've been thinking. The Red-Faced Guild wasn't just a group of men hired to copy encyclopedias, and it wasn't just about stealing gold. No, there was a far more intricate plan in motion. The real mastermind behind this operation had a much bigger agenda. Someone with the resources to make this whole thing work. Someone with influence." I took a step closer to him. "Who are you thinking of, Grayson?" Grayson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the table, his fingers tracing over a list of names. He had been going through the financial records, following the money trail, and there it was, a name that kept cropping up, one that we hadn't yet fully investigated. "Duncan Hollow," Grayson muttered, his voice barely audible. The name rang a bell in my mind, but it took me a moment to remember. Duncan Hollow had been the name on the advertisement for the Red-Faced Guild. The secretary, the man who had set the whole operation in motion. But Grayson had a different theory now. He wasn't just the secretary. He was the true architect of the Red-Faced Guild. Grayson's eyes burned with intensity as he continued. Spalding was the face, the one who did the dirty work. But Hollow, Duncan Hollow, was the man behind it all. He was the one who planned everything, who financed it, and who used Spalding as a tool to carry out his scheme. The tunnels, the guild, the bank. Everything was part of his larger plan. And now that Spalding is in custody, Hollow will try to disappear. I felt a rush of realization wash over me. Hollow was behind all of it? Exactly, Grayson replied, his voice filled with quiet certainty. He's not just some secretary. He's been using the guild as a cover to carry out his own ambitions, controlling the financial systems, manipulating information, and using the red-faced guild as a front for his larger, more dangerous plan. We had spent weeks chasing down leads, following false trails, and piecing together the clues. And now, finally, we had a name. Duncan Hollow was the man we needed to find. But finding him wasn't going to be easy. Grayson's instincts told him that Hollow wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was already planning his escape. This was no longer about a simple heist. This was about stopping a criminal mastermind who had the power and influence to bring down entire financial institutions and possibly entire governments. We need to find Hollow before he can flee the country, Grayson said, turning to me with an intensity I had rarely seen in him. I know exactly where he'll be. I've been watching him, tracking his movements, and I believe he's hiding in a safe house near the outskirts of the city. My heart raced. This was it. The moment we had been working toward since we first uncovered the red-faced guild. We had the mastermind cornered. Grayson motioned to me. Get the police. I'll head to the safe house. We need to capture Hollow before he can slip away. I nodded, my nerves on edge. What if he's already gone? Grayson's face was set in stone. He won't be. Not yet. The journey to the safe house was tense. Grayson's predictions about Hollow's movements had proven correct. Hollow was still inside, planning his next move, unaware that we were closing in on him. We arrived at the building, a run-down manor on the outskirts of town. It was far from the opulence I had expected for someone of Hollow's caliber. It was as if he had wanted to blend in, to disappear into the shadows. Grayson turned to me, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Stay close, Nathaniel. This man is dangerous. He won't go down without a fight. We moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the front entrance. Grayson had already made sure that the police were positioned nearby, ready to surround the building. We were in this together, and we were finally going to end this. As we crept toward the back of the house, I could feel my heart beating louder with every step. Hollow's plan had been intricate, and his intelligence had kept us guessing for so long, but tonight we were going to end it. Grayson paused and turned to me one last time before we entered the house. "This is it, Nathaniel. Be ready for anything." With that, we stepped inside. The room was dark and cold, a stark contrast to the warm glow of the streetlights outside. We could hear Hollow's voice in the distance, speaking to someone in hushed tones. He wasn't alone. Grayson motioned for me to follow him as we crept through the hallway, our footsteps nearly silent on the old wooden floor. We reached the door to the room where Hollow was hiding. Grayson held up his hand, signaling for me to wait. With a swift motion, Grayson kicked the door open, his movements precise and calculated. Hollow looked up in surprise, his face momentarily frozen in shock before his eyes narrowed with realization. He knew it was over. "Grayson," Hollow said, his voice smooth but tinged with anger. "I should have known you'd be the one to ruin my plans." Grayson's eyes were sharp. "It's over, Hollow. You won't get away with this. Your network is finished." Hollow's smug grin faltered. "You don't understand. You've stopped one part of the plan, but there's still much more to come. You've only delayed the inevitable." Grayson stepped forward, his voice low but filled with authority. "Not anymore. You've been outplayed." With that, Hollow's expression changed. It was as if he had finally realized that he had been cornered, his plans unraveling before him. There was no escape. The police arrived moments later, surrounding the building. Hollow was arrested, and his plans were finally put to an end. As they led him away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and satisfaction. We had stopped him. The mastermind was finally in our hands. Grayson turned to me, his face calm but filled with a quiet triumph. "It's over, Nathaniel. The red-faced guild is finished. Hollow won't be able to harm anyone else." I stood there, taking in the moment. The case was closed, but the journey had taught me more than I could have imagined about the shadows that lurk just beneath the surface of society. There are always people who think they can control the world. But in the end, justice always prevails, and with that, I knew we had won. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.